let's take a minute and talk about anatomy and the considerations that we have to take into account when we're looking at the thorax and the chest wall and the integration of the ribs and accessory breathing muscles and primary breathing muscles, and what the influence of those are on structure and function. When I look at the rib cage, it's really just a large closed chain that is very integral in what we need to do for stability and mobility and protection. So if I look at the ribs, we have 12 pairs. We have 7 true ribs, which are connected to the manubrium and the spine. We have 3 floating ribs, which are connected to the spine and then to the manubrium via a cartilaginous structure. And we have 2 floating ribs, which are only connected at the vertebrae. The manubrium is divided into thirds. So we have the upper portion, which is the true manubrium. We have the body, and we have the xiphoid process. So a couple of important identifying marks within the sternum itself, and on the manubrium specifically, is the jugular notch, the clavicular notch, which is the articulation with the clavicle, the sternal angle, and then we look along the body at the specific facet joints for each of the rib articulations. So those are the articulations for the facets of ribs 1 through 7. When I look at the rib, we have a number of important components that we need to consider. On the head of the rib, which is the articulation with the vertebrae, we have the articular facets for the body, and that is typically there's typically 2 articulating surfaces. We have a neck, and then we have an articular surface for the transverse process. So when I look at a thoracic vertebrae, we'll see that there is an articular surface on the inferior aspect of the body, and there is a articulating facet on the superior aspect of the body for 2 separate ribs, and then there's a corresponding articular surface on the transverse process. Then we have the tubercle, the rib angle, the body of the rib, and the sternal end, and that's typical for ribs 2 through 9. Ribs 2 through 9 are what we consider to be the typical ribs. So I look at the costochondral and the costosternal joints. The typical costovertebral joint is synovial, and it's formed by the head of the rib and then the 2 adjacent vertebral bodies, and it's with the interposed discs. So we have facet, disc, facet on that costovertebral joint. Again, ribs 2 through 9 are typical, and that's really because the ribs have, they each have 2 articular facets, or sometimes we'll call them demi-facets. And they're separated by a ridge, which is the crest. So if we come back and look, we have the crest of the demi-facet. Now the typical costovertebral joint is divided into cavities by the interosseous ligament, or the intraarticular ligament. And that ligament extends from the crest of the head of the rib to attach the crest of the head of the rib down to attach into the annulus fibrosus of the intervertebral discs. The radiate ligament is not well visualized on my picture because the transverse process is in the way, but it's essentially deep to this transverse process, and it radiates out in 3 different directions. So we have a superior band which attaches to the superior vertebra. We have an intermediate band which attaches to the intervertebral disc, and we have an inferior band which attaches to the inferior vertebrae. And there is a fibrous capsule that surrounds the entire articulation of each of the costovertebral joints. Now we also have a costotransverse joint, which is also a synovial joint, and that is that articulation between the transverse process and the neck, or I should say the tubercle of the rib. The neck is between the tubercle and the articulation with the demifacets and the bodies of the vertebrae. So the costal transverse joint is surrounded by a thin fibrous capsule as well, and we can look and see a depiction of a superior costotransverse ligament. There is also a lateral costotransverse ligament, which again provides stability between the transverse process and the rib. So when I look at the costochondral and the costosternal joints, they are the articulation really between the first and the 10th ribs anterior-laterally with the costal cartilage. And when I look at the costosternal joints, which are formed by the articulations of the costal cartilage and ribs 1 through 7 anterior with the sternum, with rib 1 being attached to the lateral facet of the manubrium, and rib 2 is attached via the 2 demifacets of the manubral sternal junction, and 3 through 7 articulate directly with the lateral facets of the sternal body. Those joints are primarily synchondrosis. So the joints of 1, 6, and 7 are synchondrosis. The costosternal joints of 2 through 5 are synovial joints. So we have a couple of different types of joint articulations. When I look at the ligamentous support, we have an anterior and a posterior radiant costosternal ligaments, and the sternocostal ligament, which is a intraarticular ligament. So it really functions to divide the 2 demifacets of the second costosternal joint into essentially separate joints. So when I kind of want to summarize the rib cage, ribs 1 through 10 articulate posterior with the vertebral column with 2 synovial joints, the costovertebral and the costotransverse joints, and anteriorly through the costal cartilage to the manubrium and the sternum, either directly or indirectly. Indirectly with the lower floating ribs. The joints form a closed kinematic chain, which functions kind of interdependent, restricts motion, protects vital organs, and provides stability. But also provides enough flexibility to maximize function. Ribs 11 and 12 have no costovertebral, or have a single costovertebral joint, but no costotransverse joint and no attachment anterior to the sternum. So these are the only two ribs that are in an open kinematic chain scenario as opposed to a closed kinematic chain. And as such, the mobility of the 11th and 12th ribs are quite a bit better.